Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football, from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Once again, my name is Ryan Lee. I'm going to be your host for today, and thank you for joining us today. I hope you're staying safe amongst the pandemic, and we've got a whole bunch of things to talk about, including the closing end of the NCAA college football season. What does that entail? It includes the Heisman Trophy, the number 1 overall draft pick, which is going to be coming up in April, as well as the final 2 are set. Who are they? What do they bring to the table? And how do they get to where they are now? And we're even going to be previewing a little bit of what we're going to be going over in next week's show, which is going to be the number 1 team in the country taking on the number 3 team in the country in the CFP National Championship coming up on Monday. But before we get into that, let's get right into it. And we had a little bit of unexpected history come in right around last week. A lot of things usually happen, and sometimes when they do, you might not exactly expect them to happen the way they expect them to. A lot of things have been going on. There is kind of this whole crazy slurry of things going on right now, but I think one of the craziest things that I have seen is the Heisman voting. I will just be very flat out about it. I had a big time whiff. At the time recording this, it is January the 6th, and Devonta Smith, the wide receiver coming out of the Alabama Crimson Tide, has actually won the Heisman Trophy. And honestly, I'm a little surprised by the move because of the fact that it wasn't even close. I have the results here in front of me, and pulling this from ESPN's college football totals, Devonta Smith got 447 first-place votes. Trevor Lawrence got roughly half of that, about 222. And the total points that Devonta Smith got in the overall Heisman voting is a little over 1,800. Trevor Lawrence was at 1,100. I figured that Alabama's really high-powered offense was going to be at the forefront of the conversation of this Heisman vote. The only issue was I thought it was going to lean closer to Mac Jones, at least with the way that the Heisman has trended in the last several decades. I pointed this out in the last show that we had when we talked about the finalists, when it was just simply going to be Trask, Lawrence, Jones, and Smith, that it's been a really long time since the last time that an NCAA wide receiver has won the Heisman. It was one of those things that we talked about and we established because of the fact that it has just been so long. It was since 1991. The last person to just be a finalist was back in 2014. That was 7 years ago. It's been a long time since then. However, whenever anything like that happens for a long time, you see a commonality in trend or any sort of drought or what have you, it's going to break eventually. Charles Woodson won the Heisman in the late 90s. He could potentially set that benchmark into another defensive player winning the Heisman as well. Granted, Charles Woodson was a bit of a triple threat going into the return game as well, but still, a lot of what we see now, just generally in the sport of football, kind of has shifted offensively. defensive pass interference have been called a little bit more. We see not so much of the different types of penalties against the offense, however, more penalties that can be committed against the defense. In the NCAA, at least, it leans very heavily towards the offense because of the fact that not only are these players, slightly less skilled and not professional yet, but also because a lot of them, they're just fresh out of high school. They're literally just 18 years old. So the rules are just shifted and catered towards a lot of those players. And they're catered towards that type of demographic. Like, for example, the 1 foot completion rule. You see this a very common expression, for example, in the NFL, toe drag swag. Essentially, it's a sideline catch where the receiver gets both of their feet by the tippy toes inside the line before they come out. Well, in the NCAA, you only need one of those feet. It is a single toe tap. Any foot. You don't need a second. And that kind of benefits college receivers a little bit more. There's also the fact that college receivers are a lot of times getting the balls in their hands. When a lot of these AAU players, a lot of these young guys, they're growing up, they want to be the quarterback. They want to be the star of the show. Well, if you take out quarterback and you take out maybe the pass rusher, who's the next best, highest paid position in the NFL right now? It's wide receivers. You're starting to see the slow push towards wide receivers really making big money. Like, I have this thing that I just pulled up here by CBS Sports, and it's saying a lot of really major things about kind of the dynamic that the NFL has shifted towards. Highest paid position is obviously quarterback. No surprise there. In terms of the highest paid player, the next highest paid position is linebacker and pass rusher, Khalil Mack and Aaron Donald. And then once you get past Aaron Donald and Khalil Mack, guess who's next? Wide receivers. The wide receiver market has one of two things. Number one, it's slowly become oversaturated just from the fact that there are so many good receivers coming out of college. However, there is also such a high demand for those great receivers as well, because of multiple factors, including the fact that a lot of these guys are coming straight out of college. The game has become further and further injury prone. The fact that the NFL is paying out more money, and the fact that there's all these other factors that kind of aren't in the control of a lot of people, including stuff like injuries, including stuff like cap hit. Wide receivers is one of the deepest position rooms in the entire NFL. And because there's such a necessity for so many good receivers who can essentially run any route, I can kind of understand the entire idea of putting Devonta Smith as one of the top front runners for the Heisman. It's kind of an interesting story, especially when you think about how quarterbacks, they don't just have that first read. They got first, second, third, fourth, however many reads you got. You might have one of them that's a running back. You might have one of them that's a tight end. But more likely than not, you're going to have at least two receivers, maybe in some instances as high as 4 to 5. As we start seeing, these athletes getting bigger, stronger, they're playing more physical. What happens when those things happen? You get a lot of these crazy, limbs twisting, harder hits, concussions especially, even with the better helmet technology. You start seeing all of these things popping up, especially when you think about a year like 2020, when you have all these players going in the COVID list as well, when you have practice squad guys who have to emulate the style of a certain player. Wide receivers are going to be in high demand. They're getting paid quite a lot of money. Julio Jones, currently the top paid wide receiver at $22 million. And then you have Amari Cooper and Michael Thomas, who both just signed $20 million contracts within the past 2 years. Devonta Smith getting the Heisman isn't a problem for me. It's something I actually highly respect. It's something that I think, for me personally, I can get behind. But one of the themes I went across last week is that Heisman voting, winning that trophy, doesn't have a perfect correlation with long-term success. Nothing does. We've seen a lot of Heisman winners fail. We've seen a lot of guys who are considered busts become some of the top players in their respective positions. We've seen a lot of guys who are essentially seen as just college stars, and the second they get in the NFL, they fizzle out for whatever reason. Most recent example, probably the most popular example, is Johnny Manziel. Robert Griffin, another great one. I guess most recently, you got Dwayne Haskins. These guys who are supposed to create such giant amount of hype, all this buzz. You know, they're going to go to a team, they're going to change their franchise forever, and just nothing happens. Because in stuff like the Heisman voting, it's not a foregone conclusion that just because you're the best player in NCAA in a certain year, it doesn't necessarily mean you're the same best player when you're in the NFL. I don't expect Devonta Smith, when he gets in the NFL, to surpass guys like Julio Jones, to surpass guys like Stephon Diggs, to surpass guys like DeAndre Hopkins. No, I do not. I do expect him to kind of be on a very similar-ish tier. Maybe ones that Justin Jefferson this past year got through, or maybe ones that Brandon Ayuk got through when he was drafted this year. Gabriel Davis is another great example. Guys who aren't going to be those number one receivers, but can make a great 2 or 3, and then due to whatever reason, trades, caps, whatever, can become that number one later. Right now with the draft order the way it is, at least in terms of that need, it looks like Devonta Smith is not going to go to the Jets, and he's not going to go to the Jags because they have more important needs. However, Miami is drafting number 3, and if they stick with Tua, they might try to build around him by giving him some weapons. They could try to give Joe Burrow a second option complement to T. Higgins, but I doubt it. The Philadelphia Eagles might try their 900th failed wide receiver. Carolina maybe. The Giants maybe. The Patriots might take their shot on Devonta Smith and actually land it for once. Who knows? However, what we do know is that this year, the 2020 to 2021 season, Devonta Smith was the best player. Do I personally think that it should have been someone else? Yes. But a whole big thing about the Heisman is that it is a bit of a splash award. You need to show that something about you is just absolutely exceptional. It's at a different level than what everyone else is doing. Trevor Lawrence was just so high that eventually it just kind of got a little stale. Yeah, Trevor Lawrence is amazing, and yes, he can thrill you, but it's just whatever at this point. 105 receptions for 1,600 yards, sitting at almost 16 yards per catch. 20 touchdowns this year alone. They even got a little bit creative and helped Smith to get to a rushing touchdown as well. One of the best years for a receiver in a very long time. And Smith is a senior. I made this point with another high-flying senior the other week as well, with Trey Sermon in the Big Ten championship game. That once you put these players in these do-or-die situations, in this case for Devonta Smith, he knew that he had one more year under Nick Saban. He knew he had Mac Jones, who was most likely going to take over after backing up Tua the year before. He knew all this stuff. He was a senior too, and he also knew that you had all these receivers. You had Ayuk, you had Jefferson, you had T. Higgins, you had Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs. You had all of these great receivers coming into the draft last year, and Smith probably knew that he didn't have good enough numbers to really push him over the edge into that first round talent or into that upper echelon of the first round. 68 receptions, 1,200 yards, 18 yards per reception, and 14 touchdowns. Those are really solid. But he wanted to up that. He wanted to get 400 more yards. He wanted to get 50 more receptions. He wanted to get a half dozen more touchdowns. He wanted to do that. He wanted to set the bar even higher for receivers. And the most difficult thing about what Devonta Smith has just done, he has raised the bar for receivers who want to win the Heisman. And you want to know the craziest thing about all of that? Let me put it this way. Alabama right now has played through 12 games. The undefeated LSU Tigers of last year played 15 games. What I did was I took the 3 highest statistical receivers of last year's draft class. It is Justin Jefferson of the now Minnesota Vikings, formerly LSU Tigers, Jerry Jeudy of the last year's Alabama Crimson Tide, now Denver Broncos, and CeeDee Lamb, the current Dallas Cowboy, who was formerly part of the Oklahoma Sooners. Let's go through this. Lamb played through, I believe, 14 games. What Lamb was able to do in 14 games was 1,300 yards and 14 touchdowns, which is really good. Jerry Jeudy, in 13 games, was able to get 1,100 yards and 10 touchdowns last year. Justin Jefferson, he was part of that LSU team, current Pro Bowler. He got 1,500 yards and 18 touchdowns in that 15-game stretch. And then you take Devonta Smith, which is just ridiculous, by the way. Let's say Devonta Smith played the full 15-game schedule like Justin Jefferson did. And by the way, Jeudy and Lamb were not that far behind. They were maybe about 200 to 300 yards behind of Jefferson with 1 to 2 games less. So let's say in that case, all three of them at roughly an even playing field, roughly 1,500 yards in 15 games. If you take Smith's 1,600 yards and spread it out into a 15-game pace, he is on track for 2,000 yards. Smith in touchdowns, he's on track for 25 touchdowns. The highest reception total for any of these 3 guys last year was Justin Jefferson. He had 111. You take that pace, 131 receptions. You take Smith's stats and divide them out into a 15-game playoff season all the way up to the national championship like there would be in a normal year. He blows some of the best round 1 people of last year out of the water. And if you take him from last year, most likely he'd be a late first rounder, mid first rounder. But what he did with the performance he put on this year, with the stats he's put on this year, the pace he put on, if he were to hypothetically go a 15-game season like these other receivers did last year, he made himself go from a mid to late first into easily a top first. He easily went from one of those teams in the middle. Maybe Denver takes Smith instead of Jerry Jeudy. Maybe Dallas chooses Smith over CeeDee Lamb. But based on what I've been able to see out of the draft order for this past season, and if I had to be realistic, and if I had to call my shot, Devonta Smith will go number 3 to Miami. He's going to be a Dolphin at number 3. If I had to call my shot right now, way too early to know about the scouting reports and all that stuff. Miami does not have very much help on the outside. They have one legitimate receiver, Devonta Parker. I think with him and Smith, Tua can really progress. And that's what I got to say about the Heisman race and why Devonta Smith winning had such a ginormous impact. And that's what I had for that. And when we're coming back right after the break, we're going to go into the number 1 overall draft pick, most likely, and how he's going to change not only a franchise, but why having such a great talent in such a quarterback-heavy draft can really push a franchise forward, followed by previews into the national championship. Stick with us.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And we're back here on the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. We just got through the Heisman voting and how Devonta Smith could not only affect a future team, but why it is so important to the wide receiver position as a whole. Ryan Lee here once again, and we have a very interesting topic for you, which is Trevor Lawrence, most likely considered to be the number 1 overall draft pick. Why each team who's drafting on top can succeed with their potential draft pick, and how number 1 overall draft picks as a whole just affect a team. The thing with the number 1 overall draft pick is that it is no foregone conclusion that it is going to be success. Yes, a lot of first overall draft picks have succeeded in the NFL. Lots of them have. Even if you include the past 3 number 1 overall draft picks, Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray, and Joe Burrow, their careers are so young still. Kyler Murray, he was drafted in 2019. This was only his 2nd year in the league, and he's already not only won Rookie of the Year, but he's won a Pro Bowl as well. Myles Garrett, he was drafted in 2017. He's made multiple Pro Bowls. Almost every single player in the past several years, up until about Cam Newton, has at least made a Pro Bowl. In some cases, they win Rookie of the Year, like Cam Newton, like Kyler Murray. And in some cases, you might not have the greatest career. Whether if it's due to one of many things, whether if it's poor effort like Jamarcus Russell, whether if it's bad circumstances like David Carr back in 2002, or whether if it's just overall bad luck and all the injury bugs just decided to come on to you like Sam Bradford did. And these are only examples from the past 20 years, by the way. Every single other player on the list have made at least a Pro Bowl in the past 20 years. Except for David Carr, Jamarcus Russell, and Sam Bradford for the reasons I just stated. Every single other player who's been drafted number 1 overall has had at least a Pro Bowl season. And in some of those cases, there was a very clear number 1. Eli Manning, 2004, won a pair of Super Bowls and was MVP of said Super Bowls. Cam Newton, drafted in 2011, he won league MVP just a few years ago. Multiple Pro Bowlers, Super Bowl champions. A lot of them have come from number 1 overall draft picks. However, let's get into some of those generational talents like I discussed. The Lucks, the Elways, the Peytons. That's usually what you hear compared to Clemson's Trevor Lawrence. Let's start with Luck because his list is the shortest. It was 4 Pro Bowls, but his injury was derailed by injuries, and he is easily going to be a Hall of Fame potential if he stayed healthy. The now president of the Denver Broncos, John Elway, he won 2 Super Bowls. He won a Super Bowl MVP, league MVP, first team All-Pro, 9 Pro Bowl selections. He's led the league in passing. He's made the 90s All-Decade team. He also made not only the Hall of Fame, but John Elway was part of the All-100 team, the team that the NFL compiled together when they had its 100-year anniversary. They took basically the 10 best players from every position, and John Elway was one of them. Peyton also had a very lengthy career as well. Multiple NFL records that still hold to this day. 2-time Super Bowl, 1-time Super Bowl MVP, 5-time league MVP, 7-time All-Pro. Led the league in passing 3 times, led the league in touchdowns 3 times. The 2000s All-Decade team, All-Time team, and also most likely is going to be a part of the Hall of Fame. Both Elway and Manning, by the way, are part of the College Football Hall of Fame as well, with Tennessee and Stanford, respectively. A lot of times when college players come out of college, whether if it's just minor league in some sports or whether if it's in the NFL, you have a lot of players who seem to be sure things. Some players who are going to be the next great thing. They have all this hype around them. Trevor Lawrence is one of those guys. Who are some of the most recent examples of this generational hype that you might see? Well, I just listed 3 of them in Luck, Manning, and Elway, and they all had successful careers. If you go over to the NBA, the most obvious selection is LeBron. And we know where he is now. He's arguably, debatably, he's consensus number 2 right now, but he maybe in a couple years could surpass MJ, the great Michael Jordan, as the greatest of all time in the NBA. I'm not saying it is happening. I'm saying there's a chance for it. If you go into the MLB, a lot of people praised Bryce Harper before getting into the MLB, and he's been flourishing so far. Going into, let's say, Olympics, we all know that Michael Phelps is considered the greatest swimmer of all time. 23 gold medals is something that's probably never going to get touched. 8 golds in a simple Olympics is probably never going to get touched. However, the simple fact that he was just so good at such a young age made people understand and realize that he's going to be a threat and a weapon in the next several years. And he did so all the way from 2000 at his first Olympic trials all the way to 2016 when he ended his career. There are 2 more prospects in the NHL who have also been touted as generational talents where teams were actually actively tanking to get these players. And they're both still in the NHL today. It is the Pittsburgh Penguins with Sidney Crosby and also the Edmonton Oilers with Connor McDavid. Crosby back in 2005, he literally changed the entire Pittsburgh Penguins organization. The Penguins were literally supposed to die, and then Crosby came about. He started off with a bang. All rookies, his first year, and his second year. Only his second year in the league. He started what would eventually become 8 NHL All-Stars. In that second year, season number 2, by the way, this kid's 20 years old. He not only wins the Art Ross as the league's leading point scorer, he also leads the Hart, which is the league MVP, the Ted Lindsay, the league MVP according to the players, the Mark Messier Award, which is one of the top leadership awards. And he also not only did that, but he also led the Pittsburgh Penguins to what eventually become 3 Stanley Cups. He changed the Pittsburgh Penguins, Sidney Crosby did. Peyton Manning, when he joined, he changed the Indianapolis Colts. LeBron and the Cavs were everything. Without LeBron, I don't even think Cleveland is still relevant. I mean, Connor McDavid, he has the current richest contract in the National Hockey League right now. He's made 4 All-Stars in a 5-year career. He's won the Art Ross as the league's leading point scorer in his 2nd year. League MVP, the Hart Memorial Trophy, his 2nd year. The Ted Lindsay, the league MVP according to the players, his 2nd year. Of course, Connor McDavid's still a young player. Sidney Crosby is a little older. Crosby was drafted back in 05. McDavid was drafted back in 15. But hey, these guys still have great careers left to go. Even on an international stage, which includes some Olympic gold medals, some world championships. It's no limit to what these guys can do, these generational talents. You know, the Crosbys, the McDavids, the LeBrons, the Peytons, the Elways, the Lucks, the Bryce Harpers, the Phelpses. There's a reason those guys are such highly touted and such hot commodities right out of the gate, because they are for a reason. Those aren't flukes. If they were, something would be wrong. It just comes down to that hard work and effort. Sometimes a little bit of talent as well, but also hard work beats talent. And Trevor Lawrence could be in that similar boat with, you know, the LeBrons, the Crosbys, the McDavids, the Peytons, the Elways. He's most likely going to have a very successful career. The floor for what Trevor Lawrence can do is going to be similar to what Andrew Luck accomplished, which was just multiple-time Pro Bowler. On track for a Hall of Fame career, and it's just going to be a whole bunch of woulda, coulda, shoulda. And none of it through the fault of Trevor Lawrence himself. He doesn't control Shad Khan. He doesn't control the fact that the Jacksonville Jaguars essentially cleaned house. The only thing we know for sure is that the last quarterback that the Jaguars tried to select did not go very well. It was Blake Bortles. The Jaguars are often considered kind of a meme in the NFL community. They're considered a joke because of a multitude of things. I think the choice, at least in terms of who to draft for Jacksonville, is very simple. It's very straight and easy. It's going to be Trevor Lawrence. But there's a big issue with not just necessarily the Jacksonville Jaguars taking Trevor Lawrence specifically, but, you know, the Jaguars have officially been confirmed to have the number 1 overall draft pick. That's what it is right now. There's already the photoshops being made of Trevor Lawrence being a Jag. However, the Jaguars have not had the greatest luck when it comes to drafting. I'm going to go through some examples over the past couple of years of how the Jaguars have just really missed on a lot of really good potential draft picks. From 2011, which was the Cam Newton's draft, Jacksonville drafted Blaine Gabbert, number 10 overall. He's often considered a backup quarterback now. And who did they have that potentially still on the board? They had Cameron Jordan, multiple-time Pro Bowler. I believe is also an All-Pro, the defensive line. And, who else? 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, J.J. Watt. And the next pick, 2012, they draft wide receiver Justin Blackmon. Don't even think he's in the league anymore. But do you know who they could have gotten? Could have gotten a Fletcher Cox, multiple-time Pro Bowler and All-Pro. Could have gotten a Ryan Tannehill, revitalized his career. Could have gotten a Luke Kuechly, multiple-time Defensive Player of the Year. Stephon Gilmore, also Defensive Player of the Year. Let's go to 2014. They selected Blake Bortles, number 3 overall at quarterback. Well, who's still left on the board? Multiple-time Defensive Player of the Year, Khalil Mack. Multiple-time Defensive Player of the Year, Aaron Donald. 2015, they drafted Dante Fowler, a linebacker. Who did they leave on the table still? They left a lot of real good guys. They could have gotten Marcus Peters over at corner. Maybe they could have gotten some help in the backfield, Todd Gurley. Or they could have gotten a Bolitnikoff Award winner and someone who was a Heisman finalist, Amari Cooper, who is now with the Cowboys. The one hit they had in the last 10 years, 2019 to 2011, one person, maybe two in that entire time stretch was a hit. And it was in 2016. Cornerback, Jalen Ramsey. And of course, the whole Jalen Ramsey situation got sour because of the way the Jags are kind of run. 2017, Leonard Fournette was taken by the Jags. But the next several players taken after him showed why the Jags had such a rough time every time through. Yes, Leonard Fournette was solid, but he's no longer with the team. But who was next up? Jamal Adams, Christian McCaffrey, Deshaun Watson, Patrick Mahomes, Marshawn Lattimore, Tre'Davious White, T.J. Watt, this year's Defensive Player of the Year in the NFL. All of them were passed up for Leonard Fournette. 2018, the Jags drafted Taven Bryan. And you know who was picked only 4 picks later? Future MVP for the Baltimore Ravens, coming out of Louisville, Lamar Jackson. Last year was the only other hit that Jacksonville got, which was the lineman Josh Allen. Not the quarterback Josh Allen from Wyoming, who's with the Buffalo Bills, but the current Jag who got drafted from Kentucky, the linebacker Josh Allen. The point I'm trying to make isn't that Lawrence is going to be a bust. I'm not saying that Lawrence is going to be a bust. I think he has zero bust potential. The point I'm trying to make is that the Jags have had some bad luck prior. They've had some rough scouting in the past. And that's why a lot of their draft picks might not always pan out. But it is up to this new regime in Jacksonville to build around him. That's all I got for this segment, and we've got one last part coming up. Put your money where your mouth is. Of course, I was a little bit off last week. I will preface it by saying that I was 0 for 2 last week on the spreads. I was 1-0 in terms of my actual predictions, but we will be doing a little bit deeper dive on that right after this.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Back here for the final time here on the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Once again, Ryan Lee here for the final time, and we are going to be going into the reason why all of this has been going on, the reason why we care about any of this. The CFP, yes, the College Football Playoff was over the weekend, at least the first round of it, and we are going to be going into the finals on Monday. I believe the date on that exactly is the 11th. And the final 2 contenders are in. Who are they? What do they bring to the table? And how can each team win? And who are my picks to win that trophy this year? Now, let's start with the first game in order of who played first. So in this case, it was Notre Dame and Alabama. This game wasn't close. Honestly, nothing about this game was close. I remember hearing the broadcast with Sean McDonough and company over at ESPN, and essentially they said a bunch of stuff about how Brian Kelly really wanted to, bring something into it, just stay within striking distance of Alabama. And they were rolling the first quarter, 14-0 in the first quarter, 21-7 going into halftime. And after halftime, I think they were just so comfortable with a 14-point lead that Alabama just kind of coasted the rest of the way through the game. Notre Dame was, at least defensively, they played really well throughout the entire year. However, I think part of Notre Dame was that, yes, they had a lot of hype because they beat Clemson. Yes, they had a lot of hype because they had this very stout, tough, physical defense. However, when your quarterback is subpar, you can only go as so far. Ian Book did not have the greatest day. 229 yards and interception for Ian Book. But at the same time, what they're most known for is, kind of bringing the physicality to that, the offensive line part of it. And, the offensive line couldn't dominate the line of scrimmage. Kyron Williams only had 64 yards of scrimmage, only 139 yards rushing total. And then the other side of the coin, you had Najee Harris just absolutely flying off at 125 yards of rushing the entire day. Alabama brought decent pressure, 3 tackles for loss and 2 sacks on Book. There was even a little stretch in time in the early fourth, late third quarter, I believe, where Ian Book was believed to have an injury, and then they brought him back into the game. But another part of that is emphasizing why Alabama is so dominant. Why any team that Nick Saban's going to have is going to be so good for so long. They have 3 of the top 5 Heisman candidates on their team in Harris, Jones, and Smith. And if I had to go off of who's the best trio in the NCAA, at least when you put it that way, the running back, quarterback, and wide receiver position, without a doubt, the best trio in the NFL right now is Alabama. You can kind of look through the entirety of the NFL playoffs, which are going on today as the release of this episode. And a lot of those top teams, a lot of the best teams, those top tier teams, those teams who are most likely going to win, they've got amazing trios. That running back, quarterback, wide receiver combination. Who's the top contender this year? The Green Bay Packers. Devontae Adams, first team All-Pro. Aaron Rodgers, first team All-Pro. Aaron Jones. Those are 3 great candidates. And then they're also loaded with All-Americans as well. There were so many All-Americans coming from Alabama specifically. All 3 of the players from the Alabama Crimson Tide, they're All-Americans. Devonta Smith, Najee Harris, and Mac Jones are all consensus not American. Are all consensus All-Americans. They even got an offensive lineman in the mix. Some players in the secondary in the mix. It kind of shows that domination that Alabama has over the rest of the NCAA and why they should absolutely be concerned. You have 3 All-Americans on your team, arguably almost without a doubt the best player in each of those 3 positions. The only exception I'd make is that Trevor Lawrence was a better quarterback this year than Mac Jones was. Not just due to the perception, but also due to what I've seen. And Jones was easily number 2 behind Lawrence. When you put all that together, you have the second best quarterback, the best running back, the best wide receiver. No wonder why the offense has been so explosive. No wonder why the offense has been putting 30, 40, 50 plus on almost every single team they've encountered. No wonder why they've done that. It's almost too easy for them. This highlight reel of a play where Najee Harris clears a defender, it's so great and it's so Sports Center worthy. But at the same time, when you consider how good these players are compared to the rest of the field, it seems like nothing to them. It's like that one SpongeBob meme where you have this giant monster thing and SpongeBob is just looking there bored and uninterested. That's Alabama right now. That's how they looked against Notre Dame. The lead at one point for Alabama was something kind of crazy. It was 31-7. They were up by 24. And yes, I whiffed on Alabama minus 20, but I did think that Alabama was winning regardless. Once they got to that 24-point lead, they knew Notre Dame wasn't doing anything. So instead of just racking up the points, could have gone 40 plus points easily, they chose to sit on it and wait for the clock to expire. Despite the fact that Notre Dame had more clock possession, despite the fact that Notre Dame had fewer penalties given up, it didn't matter to Alabama. They were just so dominant and so good in the position groups, it didn't matter to them. They knew they had that game on lock. Now, one team who most certainly did not have their game on lock was the Tigers of Clemson. I'm honestly surprised how badly Ohio State dominated Clemson. And I'm not going to lie, I did take a big fat whiff on this game. I picked Clemson minus 8. I thought they were going to win and cover the minus 7. And you're kind of seeing two very similar storylines here for Ohio State specifically. Number one, their number one receiver, Chris Olave, is back. And he had a monstrous day. 132 yards, 2 touchdowns on his first game back. He wasn't in the Big Ten Championship. One of their tight ends, Jimmy Ruckert, he got 2 touchdowns of his own. However, the two players who weren't performing the greatest but really had resurgence in this Sugar Bowl was Justin Fields. 6 touchdowns, 385 yards. And the running back who erupted in the Big Ten Championship, Trey Sermon. He's really stepped up to the plate ever since he's had to take over that starting position. And with Master Teague unavailable, they're going to have to go to Sermon. And he's been performing absolutely at a really high standard right now. A touchdown and over 250 yards between rushing and receiving combined. He's playing for his career right now. This isn't just a do or die situation for just Sermon and his football career, but he could potentially use those last 3 games alone to be like, hey, I deserve a shot at the NFL. Maybe as an undrafted free agent, maybe as a 7th round draft pick. Who knows? But he's playing for his career right now. Even practice squad, Trey Sermon could impress. Ohio State did a great job making Trevor Lawrence uncomfortable. 5 tackles for loss, a pair of sacks, and 6 passes deflected. That defense can disrupt an offense very similar to how it did to Clemson. It kind of messed up Lawrence's rhythm with his receivers. It kind of messed up everything they had. But also one of the big things that Clemson just couldn't do, it was one of their breads and butter throughout the year, is run. They made Travis Etienne's job so difficult. Part of that was probably because Lawrence launched it 48 times and only handed it off 22 times. If you don't include Trevor Lawrence's carries, there was only 10 times the Tigers ran. Lawrence threw it 48 times. That's a crazy amount of time to be holding onto the football like that, taking sacks, taking fumbles, getting pressure in your face. It's why Ohio State dominated the time of possession by about 5 minutes. It's more or less why Clemson lost. They changed their game plan so much to have this balanced running and passing offense that when it came time to step up big, Ohio State, they kept with the game plan. The only difference was Fields didn't perform as badly as he did versus Northwestern. He performed as well as he did all the other games of the year. Fields stepped up. Sermon is on a roll. His number one receiver, Chris Olave, came back from injury. And what did that give Ohio State? A chance at the national championship. Not just a chance. a fighting chance. And most likely a chance to go up against who is without a doubt the best team in all of football, Alabama. It is the CFP Final. The 7-0 Ohio State Buckeyes, the number 3 overall seed, taking on the Alabama Crimson Tide, taking as the number 1 seed over at 12-0. The spread currently at 9. The spread currently at -8 in favor of the Alabama Crimson Tide, going to Hard Rock Stadium in the 305 Miami, Florida. The Alabama Crimson Tide sitting at 48.2 points a game versus Ohio State Buckeyes are sitting at 43.4 points a game. However, these defenses are at a very good time against opposing offenses so far, as the Buckeyes are only allowing 21 points against, while the Crimson Tide are holding people at 19. In terms of yardage production, these two offenses and defenses are very similar in terms of their totals, 545 to 535. And in their defenses as well at 358 to 351. However, the big story between these two teams is how the offenses are split. For the Buckeyes, they have a tout running offense. They are carrying 272 yards per game. A game-time decision will be made on whether or not Master T can play. However, with the last several weeks going on, Trey Sermon is going to have to carry that load, and Justin Fields, he's going to have to step up, unlike he did versus Northwestern, but in the way he did versus Clemson. 272 yards per game, and he racked up a grand total of 6 touchdowns in that Sugar Bowl, as well in the Mercedes-Benz Superdome. And then on the other side of the coin, Najee Harris, not as much of a prolific runner because Mac Jones, the number 3 candidate for the Heisman, is absolutely on a tear right now. Not only can his 36 touchdowns propel the Alabama Crimson Tide, but most importantly, he's got the help of, without a doubt, the best receiver in the game, Devonta Smith. 1,600 yards and 20 touchdowns, which led to the Crimson Tide having 350 passing yards on the year thus far. And with the potential of getting back their other star receiver, Jalen Waddle, due to an ankle injury, possibly coming back into the Alabama Crimson Tide lineup, this game could get ugly fast. And in terms of defenses, Ohio State is very defensive heavy on the front 7. They love to stop the run, 96 yards per game. However, that is not where the issues lie. The secondary allowing 260 yards per game. It is really going to be a matchup of, can Ohio State secondary get some defense on Devonta Smith? Can they find clever ways to double him, triple him, put some zone reads, confuse Mac Jones a little bit, and reduce that 350 yards passing? And on the other side of the coin, the Alabama Crimson Tide, they are very balanced on defense as well. They are a little more secondary heavy. However, they can't stop the run as well. Only 107 yards against on the ground and only 240 in the air versus the secondary. The really big matchup to look for here is Mac Jones and Devonta Smith versus the Buckeye secondary. Can the Buckeyes do anything to stop Jones and Harris? Can the Buckeyes do anything to stop Jones and Smith? Or Jones and Smith just going to have an absolute field day, elevating the draft status, elevating Devonta Smith as a potential can't-miss product? Or is Justin Fields going to have absolutely a gun show similar to how he did versus Clemson? Will this be a shootout? Will this be a dogfight? I'm most certainly seeing this game being a shootout with the way Justin Fields has been performing ever since that poor performance versus Northwestern. With the combination of his ability to step up, as well as for Trey Sermon having himself an absolute career 2 games, I expect this game, the final game most likely of his college career as a senior. He is playing not only for his college life, he is playing for his life in the sport of football as a whole. This game, if Trey Sermon can step up and have a very similar performance like he did versus Northwestern, like he did versus Clemson, he can potentially put himself in the 6th, 7th round, maybe an undrafted free agent. He could potentially see himself in the practice squad. Who knows? But right now, these games, he's playing for his football career right now. The number 1 matchup here to look for is that secondary versus Jones and Smith. And if you flip the coin a little bit, can Trey Sermon break through the front 7 of the Crimson Tide? Can that running game control the time of clock for the Buckeyes and keep the Crimson Tide on the field? Keep Jones and Smith on the sideline. Make them sip their Gatorade. Make them sit on the bench. Make them only throw warm-up throws to each other. This game is going to be absolutely amazing. It is going to be absolutely fantastic. It is going to be a light show. It's going to be a gun show. The over-under is sitting at 75. 37 points per team is the rough average. Where the over-under is currently at 75. The over is going to be the call here. I can see this game getting ugly. I can see it getting the high 30s, potentially the low 40s. And -8 is 100% the way to go for me. I am taking Alabama, the Crimson Tide, to win the national championship, to cover the spread. -8. It's going to be closer to 10 to about 13. And the Buckeyes can most certainly keep up. However, it is really going to be up to the coaching battle. The thing that is pushing me over the edge to Alabama -8 is the coaching battle. Ryan Day, this is his first National Football College Finals, his first year coaching in such a high degree of competition. Yes, he made the playoffs last year, but lost in the first round. This is his first time in the final. Nick Saban's won the whole thing 6 times through, and I most certainly expect Nick Saban to do it a 7th time. That's been it for me here on the GSMC College Football Podcast, covering the CFP. I will see you next week for the next installment where we recap that game. I hope that game goes absolutely amazing. And for everything here on college football, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to like us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all your favorite social media websites. Don't forget to leave us 5 stars and a comment and a like. It really appreciates everything we do. Be sure to come back here next week when we recap this game. For all of us here at the GSMC Podcast Network, this has been the GSMC College Football Podcast. I'm Ryan Lee. Have a great rest of your night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.